The date is August 14th, 1944. It is 2:17 in the morning. Somewhere in the forests of the Haute-Saône region of occupied France, a 24-year-old American Army captain named William Egan Colby is completely still. He hasn't moved in 6 minutes, hasn't breathed above a whisper. One knee pressed into freezing French soil, the other boot gripping the sloped ground to keep him from sliding down the embankment into the road below. 12 feet away, a German Feldgendarmerie corporal stands under a lantern at a checkpoint smoking a cigarette, reading a folded letter. Behind him, 3 more soldiers lean against a requisitioned Renault truck. A farmhouse used as a billet sits 40 yards back, a light burning in the upstairs window. More men inside. Colby's mission is to reach the farmhouse on the other side of that checkpoint. A French resistance courier is inside, captured 48 hours ago. And if she talks before dawn, E12 underground cells collapse. 200 people, gone. He needs to get through that checkpoint. He cannot fire a single shot. He looks down at the object in his hands, 29 inches of matte black American engineering, heavier in front than it looks, unwieldy, strange. But tonight it is the only reason he might actually walk out of this forest alive. To understand why William Colby was crouching in a French forest with a modified grease gun, and why it may have saved his life, you need to understand the catastrophic noise problem that had been slowly killing Allied covert operations since 1942. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the creation of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, on June 13, 1942. And this was America's first centralized intelligence and special operations agency. Its director, Major General William Wild Bill Donovan, 59 years old, a decorated Great War veteran who had earned the Medal of Honor at the Meuse-Argonne, understood something that conventional military commanders did not. In occupied Europe, the most dangerous weapon wasn't the one that fired the fastest. It was the one that fired the quietest. The OSS mission in France required agents, American officers, a British SOE liaison, and French resistance fighters, to operate inside towns, forests, and farmhouses where German soldiers were billeted sometimes 50 feet away. A single pistol shot was enough to wake a billet, enough to trigger a patrol, enough to unravel months of preparation and kill everyone involved. By early 1943, the OSS Technical Division, operating out of a converted Maryland estate they called the Farm, had cataloged exactly how many operations in occupied France had been compromised or blown entirely by weapon sound. The number was staggering. Between January and October 1942 alone, British SOE records estimated that at least 31 separate resistance networks in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had been exposed or disrupted at the moment of action, when a weapon discharged during what was supposed to be a silent operation. The suppressor, or silencer, as the public incorrectly called it, existed long before the war. Hiram Percy Maxim had patented the first practical design in 1909. British intelligence had used rudimentary suppressed weapons since the 1930s. The problem wasn't the concept. The problem was applying it effectively to a weapon that could handle the stresses of combat. In the standard sidearm options available to OSS operatives in 1942 and 1943 were deeply flawed for this purpose. The .45 ACP M1911A1 pistol could accept a suppressor, but the .45 ACP cartridge was subsonic. It traveled below the speed of sound, which meant it didn't produce a supersonic crack. and a suppressor could reduce the mechanical noise to something manageable. But a pistol fired one round at a time, and in a close-quarters nighttime operation where you encountered more than one enemy simultaneously, a pistol could get you killed between shots. The Thompson submachine gun, the famous Tommy gun, was entirely impractical with a suppressor. It was already 10.8 pounds loaded. It cycled at 700 rounds per minute on the M1928 model. The mechanical noise alone from the bolt cycling was enormous. The barrel was only 10.5 inches. Is any suppressor long enough to meaningfully reduce the sound signature added unacceptable length and weight to a weapon that was already too heavy for clandestine work? What OSS Technical Division needed was something different entirely. A submachine gun light enough to carry under a coat or in a canvas bag, cheap enough to produce by the thousands. Simple enough that a resistance fighter who had never fired an automatic weapon could learn it in an afternoon, and adaptable enough to accept a barrel modification that would allow it to function in near silence in occupied streets at 2 in the morning. In March 1943, the U.S. Army officially adopted the M3 submachine gun. The designer was George Hyde, a German-born American engineer working for the Inland Division of General Motors. The production supervisor was Frederick Sampson. Together, they had created something that the Army brass initially hated, and the OSS immediately recognized as exactly what they needed. The M3 looked like something assembled in a garage from plumbing parts. It had a tubular receiver stamped from sheet metal, a wire folding stock, a simple ejection port that you opened and closed with your thumb. No traditional safety lever at all. The U.S. Army's official assessment in October 1942 called it crude in appearance. A Stars and Stripes correspondent, and upon seeing it for the first time at Fort Benning in April 1943, called it the grease gun, because it looked exactly like the shop tool mechanics used to lubricate axles. The nickname was unkind. It was also permanent. But the grease gun had numbers that mattered. It weighed 7.95 pounds fully loaded with a 30-round magazine. Without the magazine, just 5.45 pounds. Its barrel was 8 inches, and its overall length with the wire stock folded was only 22.8 inches. Short enough to conceal under a military overcoat. And at the guide lamp division of General Motors, where production contracts had been signed by November 1942, it cost $17.44 per unit to manufacture. The Thompson M1928A1 cost over $70 per unit. The Tommy gun was a craftsman's weapon. The M3 was an industrial one, and that distinction was about to matter enormously. But the feature that made OSS Technical Division's eyes widen was the barrel. The M3's barrel was a simple threaded steel tube, 8 inches standard, removable, and the threading was robust enough to accept attachments. Attachments like the barrel extensions and integral suppressor housings that OSS engineers at Station S in Maryland were already prototyping by the spring of 1943. By October 1943, the first modified M3 units were being field tested at a range outside Washington, D.C. By February 1944, they were being packed into waterproof containers and dropped by B-24 Liberators into the French countryside at night. If you want to understand exactly what that modified barrel did to the sound signature of a .45 ACP round, and why the men who carried it into occupied France never talked about it publicly for 30 years, stay with us. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories like this one. In William Colby's hands on the night of in William Colby's hands on the night of August 14, 1944, was an OSS-modified M3A1 submachine gun, the updated version of the original M3 adopted in December 1944, though field-modified prototypes had been circulating through OSS channels since early 1944. But the critical feature was not the M3A1 changes. It was the barrel. The standard M3 barrel, 8 inches, .45 caliber threaded at the muzzle, had been extended using what OSS Technical Division designated the T3E1 barrel assembly. This was not a simple thread-on suppressor like the public imagines from the movies, a small cylinder screwed onto a pistol barrel. This was an integral system. The extended barrel assembly ran the entire length of what appeared to be an oversized tube attached to the front of the receiver. Externally, and it looked as though someone had bolted a length of 3-inch diameter black pipe to the front of the weapon. The total length of the modified weapon, with the extended barrel assembly installed and the wire stock folded, was approximately 29 inches. With the stock extended, 35 inches, the weight with the suppressor assembly and a loaded 30-round magazine, approximately 10.5 pounds. Inside that front tube assembly was an engineering solution to a precise acoustic problem. Then when a .45 ACP round fires in a standard M3, 3 distinct sounds are produced. First, the crack and bang of the propellant gases venting from the muzzle at extremely high pressure. This is the primary gunshot sound, typically measuring 157 to 163 decibels at 1 meter. Second, the supersonic crack of the projectile if the ammunition is loaded to supersonic velocity. But .45 ACP standard military ball ammunition travels at approximately 830 feet per second, which is subsonic, and so this crack is absent, making it naturally suppressor-friendly. Third, the mechanical cycling of the bolt. The steel-on-steel clank of the open bolt slamming forward and the empty case ejecting, which on the M3 measured approximately 130 decibels at close range. The OSS extended barrel assembly addressed the first and third sounds simultaneously. The tube contained a series of baffles, 12 in the production version, machined from aluminum and steel. Each baffle was a disc with a central aperture slightly larger than the bullet's diameter. As the propellant gases chased the bullet down the extended barrel and into the suppressor section, they expanded into the chambers between baffles, losing energy with each expansion cycle. By the time the gas reached the final baffle and vented, it was at a fraction of the pressure that produced the original 157 decibel report. The result? A .45 ACP round fired through the full OSS T3E1 assembly produced approximately 128 to 131 decibels at 1 meter. That is still louder than a jackhammer. The cinema fantasy of a gun that makes a near-silent fuse sound is exactly that. A fantasy, but 131 decibels at 1 meter sounds entirely different from 163 decibels. At 30 feet, especially in an open forest, a suppressed .45 fired from an M3 modification sounded less like a gunshot and more like a hard, flat clap, the sound a book makes when it drops flat on a tile floor. It was abrupt, percussive, but it had the sharp, echoing crack that the human brain has been conditioned since infancy to recognize as a firearm. The third problem, bolt noise, was partially addressed by the selection of a slower firing mechanism. The M3 standard cyclic rate was 450 rounds per minute compared to 700 for the Thompson. At 450 revolutions per minute, the bolt cycled about 7.5 times per second. The modified T3E1 version, in through a slightly heavier bolt assembly, was reduced further to approximately 350 to 370 rounds per minute, a deliberate engineering choice to reduce bolt noise at the cost of a marginally slower rate of fire. For OSS operations in which the operator was typically engaging 1 to 3 targets at extremely close range, this was an entirely acceptable trade. The weapon's performance at close range remained lethal. In the .45 ACP 230 grain ball projectile at 830 feet per second delivered 352 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at the muzzle. At 15 yards, the typical engagement distance in OSS checkpoint and billet operations, it retained essentially all of that energy. A single round to the upper torso was incapacitating. 2 rounds were almost invariably fatal. Approximately 2,200 of these modified M3 assemblies were produced by the OSS Technical Division between February 1944 and the end of the European War in May 1945. The barrel assemblies were manufactured separately from the base M3 receivers and shipped in waterproof canvas bags. The extended barrel tube wrapped in oilskin, the baffle stack packed in Cosmoline grease. They were inserted into training programs at OSS processing centers in London, Algiers, and Cairo. Our Jedburgh teams, the 3-man OSS/SOE/French units, dropped into occupied France beginning in June 1944. Received these as standard issue equipment beginning in July 1944. The OSS referred to the system officially as the T3E1 Extended Barrel Assembly, M3SMG. The operators who carried it called it by a shorter name, derived from its appearance, the plumber's nightmare. Its effective suppression combined with the eerie silhouette that extra foot of barrel gave the weapon, he made it unmistakable. The Germans, when they began finding them in captured operations or identifying the sound signature during nighttime ambushes, had their own name. They called it Das lange Flüstern, the long whisper. Back to the forest, August 14, 1944. 2:17 a.m., Captain William Colby, 24 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 163 pounds, from St. Paul, Minnesota, had arrived in France on the night of August 13th to 14th aboard a British Halifax bomber, parachuting into a designated drop zone in a field 12 kilometers southwest of Vesoul, with 2 other members of OSS Jedburgh Team Bruce, a French Army officer named Captain Jacques Favel, and a British communications sergeant named Roger Villebois. Favel and Villebois were holding a position 200 meters back up the hillside with the team's radio equipment. If Colby did not return to their rally point within 90 minutes, they were to destroy the radio, break contact, and establish a new safe house using the emergency resistance network. 90 minutes. He had been still for 6 of them. The checkpoint was not on the briefed maps. A new installation, set up within the last 48 hours, probably in response to increased resistance activity in the sector. The pre-mission intelligence gathered from resistance sources in Vesoul had shown the road as unguarded between 2,200 and 0500. The intelligence was 48 hours old. In August 1944, with the American breakout from Normandy in full progress and German command structures across France beginning to fragment, 48 hours of intelligence might as well have been a week. Colby knew the farmhouse layout from a hand-drawn sketch provided by the resistance contact who had reported the courier's capture. The sketch showed a main entrance off the road, guarded by the checkpoint he was now watching. and a secondary entrance through the kitchen garden, accessible from the field behind the building. The field ran uphill into the forest from the northeast, but reaching the kitchen garden meant crossing the road 30 meters north of the lantern in an area with no cover. He studied the 4 soldiers, one awake and attentive at the lantern, 2 leaning against the truck who might be half asleep, 1 he couldn't locate. Probably the 4th soldier was somewhere behind the truck, possibly sleeping in the cab. But he thought about the Thompson he had trained with at Area F, the OSS training facility outside Washington. With a Thompson, he would need all 4 soldiers incapacitated before any of them could fire or call out. At 700 rounds per minute, a Thompson fired at close range and even in a carefully timed ambush, produced enough noise to wake every person within 400 meters. The farmhouse billet, the town beyond the hill. He looked at the weapon in his hands. In the T3E1 assembly on the M3 extended from the receiver a full 14 inches beyond the standard muzzle. It made the weapon front-heavy, balance shifted entirely toward the barrel. He had practiced with it at a range in Cambridgeshire for 4 days before insertion. He knew its weight forward against a folded stock, knew the trigger pull, 7 pounds, slightly heavy, knew that at close range a 2-round burst produced a flat, a percussive crack rather than the ripping hammer crack of a standard submachine gun, knew that in the right conditions, a forest, ambient wind and trees, distance from structures, that sound could be mistaken for a branch falling, a door slamming, anything other than what it was. He began moving at 2:19 a.m. He went right downhill using the road embankment for cover and came up behind the truck from the north side of the checkpoint road. The wind was moving south, away from the farmhouse. Good. The first soldier was 3 feet away from the rear of the truck when Colby came around the bumper. The soldier had his rifle slung. He was holding a canteen and looking at the ground. 2 rounds. Flat crack, flat crack. The sound traveled maybe 30 meters before the trees swallowed it. The soldier fell against the truck. Colby caught his belt before the canteen clanged on the road surface and set it down. 11 seconds from the time he moved, and the second soldier at the truck and the one leaning turned at the sound, not alarmed, puzzled, a questioning tilt of the head. He said something in German. 1 round. He folded at the knees against the truck's running board. Colby was moving before the man hit the metal. He had 25 rounds left in the magazine. He swapped the magazine to 28 rounds now, a partial he had retained specifically for this, before he cleared the front bumper. The soldier at the lantern had turned. He heard something. His hand was moving toward the lantern. To extinguish it, instinct of a soldier who senses danger in the dark. 3 rounds from 12 feet. The lantern survived. The 4th soldier, the missing one, was in the truck cab. Colby found him asleep when he opened the passenger door 30 seconds later, weapon in hand. He was perhaps 17 years old, a Luftwaffe auxiliary far from his designated posting, filling a checkpoint slot because the Wehrmacht was running short of warm bodies in this sector, and he was not armed with anything beyond a bayonet on the seat beside him. Colby bound his hands and feet with field cord and left him under the truck. It was a decision he never explained fully in the sanitized report he filed 6 days later. But in the memoir he published decades afterward, he wrote that the boy had been asleep and posed no threat, and that the long whisper, his own term, he adopted from captured German after-action reports he had read in a London briefing, had made a choice possible that a louder weapon never would have. By 2:34 a.m., William Colby was in the kitchen garden of the farmhouse. By 2:41 a.m., the resistance courier, a 22-year-old Frenchwoman named Marguerite Petitjean, had been moved through a cellar window into the field and was being guided northeast toward the team's rally point. 11 German soldiers had been billeted in the farmhouse. None woke. At 3:12 a.m., Team Bruce made radio contact from their secondary position. The message to London was brief. Package recovered, no general alarm. The long whisper had not whispered. It had spoken in flat, percussive words, but quietly enough that the farmhouse had not heard. William Colby was not the only American carrying a T-3E1 in occupied France in the summer of 1944. Between June 6, 1944, D-Day, and September 10, 1944, and the OSS and SOE jointly deployed 93 Jedburgh teams into occupied France. Of these, 45 were confirmed to have received at least 2 T-3E1 modified M3 assemblies as part of their weapons loadout. An additional 19 teams in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy received the modified systems through separate supply channels. The total number of T-3E1 extended barrel assemblies in the field by August 31st, in 1944, excluding assemblies lost on insertion drops or recovered by German forces, was approximately 640 units. The results across theaters were within the limits of what OSS after-action reporting could confirm, remarkable for a weapon modification costing an estimated $22.50 per assembly above the base M3 price. OSS London Station compiled a classified assessment in October 1944 of reported Jedburgh team operations where the T-3E1 assembly had been the primary weapon used, and the assessment, classified secret until its partial declassification in 1992 as part of the OSS Records Act releases, identified 114 confirmed operations in which the suppressed M3 was the principal weapon at the point of contact. Of these, 87, 76.3%, were completed without triggering a general alarm that resulted in immediate pursuit. Compare that to the statistical baseline. In a separate OSS analysis of Thompson and Sten gun operations during the same period found that general alarm was triggered in 58% of close-quarters nighttime contacts, meaning more than half of all silent operations that had to be executed with standard submachine guns wound up in a running engagement within minutes of first contact. The T-3E1 did not eliminate the problem, but it shifted the odds dramatically. And Jedburgh Team Harold, operating in the Dordogne region, used a T-3E1 assembly on August 28, 1944, to eliminate a 3-man motorcycle courier relay team on the road between Périgueux and Bergerac without a single vehicle at the nearby Wehrmacht transport depot 200 meters away being alerted. The couriers had been carrying German withdrawal orders for 2 regiments, orders the resistance used to ambush both columns the following morning. Team Chloroform, operating in the Loire Valley in July 1944, used 2 T-3E1 equipped M3s to secure a bridge demolition site near Blois by eliminating a 2-man patrol without alerting the 40-man bridge guard detail 60 meters away. The bridge was demolished at 0312 on July 22, 1944, delaying the movement of a German panzer support battalion for approximately 31 hours. Not all operations worked that cleanly. Team Alexander and Brittany lost one of their 2 T-3E1 assemblies on August 3, 1944, when the suppressor baffles cracked during a night engagement, a consequence of firing too many rounds too quickly. The suppressor was a sustained fire tool, not a rapid-fire one. Firing more than 15 rounds per minute continuously through the assembly caused the baffles to heat and, in older or worn units, crack. A cracked baffle section degraded the suppression rating from 131 decibels back toward 145 to 148. Still somewhat quieter than standard, but enough to produce the recognizable crack that had gotten teams killed before. The OSS technical team in London identified this thermal limitation by September 1944. Their response was to mandate a maximum burst rate of 10 to 12 rounds per minute sustained, and to include 2 spare baffle stack assemblies with each weapon package. The oilskin-wrapped spare stacks added roughly 1.8 pounds to each team's loadout, and German intelligence officers interrogating captured resistance members in 1944 were by late summer beginning to piece together a picture. They knew the Americans were fielding a weapon that could eliminate sentries without triggering general alerts. They identified several checkpoint incidents, including 3 along the Saône River corridor in August, where guards had been found dead with no one in nearby billets having heard anything distinctive. E-field reports filed with SS Sicherheitsdienst headquarters in Paris in September 1944 described a new American weapon. A long, dark instrument makes sound like dry timber falling. The SD report estimated the weapon was at minimum 70 centimeters in length, approximately 27.5 inches, consistent with the T3E1 assembly profile. The German nickname arose somewhere in those SD intelligence files. Das lange Flüstern, the long whisper, and whether it was coined by a German intelligence analyst reading field reports or by a soldier who had encountered the weapon firsthand is not recorded. But by October 1944, it appeared in a German internal security circular distributed to garrison commanders in eastern France. Be alert for American saboteurs carrying what agents describe as das lange Flüstern, an extended-barrel submachine gun designed for silent operations. The circular was 48 hours too late for 19 garrison commanders in Lorraine. The T3E1's effectiveness rested on 2 non-negotiable conditions. Violate either one, and the suppressor became largely ornamental, and the first condition was ammunition. The .45 ACP round was inherently subsonic. This was, in fact, its defining acoustic advantage over 9mm parabellum, which was typically loaded to supersonic velocity and produced a sharp ballistic crack that a suppressor could not eliminate. The .45 ACP 230 grain ball traveled at 830 feet per second. The speed of sound at standard atmospheric conditions is 1,125 feet per second. On the 295 foot per second margin of subsonic buffer meant that even under temperature and atmospheric variation conditions in the field, cold French nights, altitude, the round remained subsonic. No supersonic crack. The suppressor handled the gas pressure. The result was that flat, low-frequency clap that the brain did not instinctively categorize as a gunshot. But if an operator, through ignorance or supply error, unloaded plus P or hot-loaded .45 ACP ammunition into the T3E1, the situation changed. Hot loads in .45 ACP could push the projectile to 950 to 980 feet per second. Still technically subsonic, but at cold temperatures, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, such as winter nights in eastern France, the speed of sound drops to approximately 1,080 feet per second, and the buffer margin shrinks dangerously. Field reports from 2 teams in Alsace in November 1944 noted suppression degradation consistent with borderline velocity ammunition. The OSS supply chain in England thereafter marked all T3E1 compatible ammunition lots with a specific sub-designation stenciled in blue ink on the canvas magazine pouches. The second condition was mechanical maintenance. The suppressor baffles were precision machined. They needed to be concentric, then perfectly aligned with the bore axis, or accuracy suffered. A warped or dirty baffle stack could deflect the bullet slightly on its way through the suppressor tube, and at ranges beyond 25 yards, and the accuracy of the weapon degraded noticeably. The OSS technical manual for the T3E1, a 14-page mimeographed document distributed with each assembly, specified that the baffles be cleaned with a bore solvent and inspected after every 50 rounds. In the field at 2 in the morning in a wet French forest, that was not always possible. In Team Suffolk, operating in the Vosges Mountains in October 1944, recorded in their after-action report that after 120 rounds through their T3E1/5 operations, the weapon was producing inconsistent accuracy beyond 10 yards. Their technical sergeant stripped the suppressor assembly by moonlight during a 36-hour layup in a hunter's blind and found 2 baffle sections canted by debris buildup. He cleaned them, realigned them, and the weapon performed to specification for the remainder of their operational period. The weight balance problem, the weapon being front-heavy by approximately 2.4 pounds compared to a standard M3, was addressed differently by different operators. Some developed a 2-hand grip with the support hand positioned on the suppressor tube itself, which also had the advantage of steady point shooting at close range. Others used the folded wire stock braced against the forearm. Several Jedburgh team commanders who filed after-action reports specifically noted that operators needed a minimum of 2 full training days with the T3E1 assembly before being trusted with it on a live operation. The balance shift was disorienting enough that a trained soldier's muscle memory from standard rifle and submachine gun training actually worked against them initially. The enemy had no direct equivalent, and the Wehrmacht standard suppressed weapon was the 7.65mm pistol with a screw-on suppressor. Individual, single-shot, limited range and capacity. The SS had experimented with suppressed MP40 variants, but 9mm parabellum supersonic velocity made meaningful sound suppression almost impossible without subsonic ammunition loads that degraded terminal performance. The German SD acknowledged in an internal September 1944 assessment that the Americans had achieved a capability in this field which we have not replicated. One specific weakness that German forces did identify. The T3E1 system took approximately 35 seconds to detach if the operator needed to switch to standard fire. In a rapidly evolving situation where a silent operation became a running fight, 35 seconds was potentially fatal. U2 Jedburgh team members in Belgium in September 1944, identities redacted in declassified records, were captured in part because the transition from suppressed to standard fire during a blown operation took longer than the situation allowed. The OSS Technical Division responded to this by including a detachment tool, a simple barrel wrench, that could reduce the transition time to 18 seconds for trained operators. 18 seconds. In a gunfight in a dark Belgian farmyard, and the long whisper had limits. Every operator who carried it understood those limits with the quiet precision of someone who knew that the next operation was the one that would test them. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The OSS was formally dissolved by President Harry Truman on September 20, 1945, Truman being deeply skeptical of a standing intelligence apparatus that had no statutory oversight mechanism. On that date, The T3E1 program ceased to exist officially. In the approximately 1,900 T3E1 assemblies that had been produced in total, including deliveries through the Italian and Pacific Theater OSS stations, were collected, logged, and stored at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland under confidential classification. The base M3 receivers were separated from the extended barrel assemblies, and the T3E1 assemblies themselves were classified secret, a higher designation than the receivers, specifically because the OSS Technical Division's assessment determined that the engineering represented a capability advance they did not want publicly documented in the post-war period. The files remained classified secret until 1992, when a large portion of OSS records were declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act and subsequent congressional pressure on the CIA, which had absorbed many OSS functions and personnel, including William Colby himself, who became CIA director in 1973. The lineage of the T3E1 is visible in every modern suppressed submachine gun platform in service with American Special Operations Forces. The core insight that a weapon designed with a large caliber, an inherently subsonic round, and an integral suppressor could achieve meaningful field suppression at acceptable size and weight became the intellectual foundation for the H and KMP-5SD, adopted by American Special Operations in the 1970s and the more recent HK-416. Suppressed configurations used by units including SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force. The M3 itself remained in U.S. military service until 1991. Issued to armored vehicle crews, including during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And the last official M3 production lot was delivered in 1945, but the weapon's simplicity meant it outlasted by decades the far more expensive weapons that were supposed to replace it. Of the approximately 622,000 M3 and M3A1 submachine guns produced in total between 1942 and 1945, fewer than 2,200 ever received the T3E1 extended barrel assembly. The weapon that changed close quarters operations in occupied France was something most American soldiers never saw, never touched, and for 30 years, you never heard about. Marguerite Petitjean, the resistance courier that William Colby extracted from the farmhouse near Vesoul on the night of August 14, 1944, survived the war. She was 22 years old on the night Colby came through the kitchen garden window. She had been held for 48 hours and had not talked. When Colby reached her in the cellar, she later wrote in a 1968 French memoir, he had said nothing. He had simply handed her a flashlight, pointed at the window, and then put his finger to his lips. She did not know the name of the weapon he carried. She described it in her memoir as an enormous black tube like something you would find in a plumber's work van. She did not know that somewhere in the SD intelligence files of the German security apparatus, it had another name. William Colby went on. He participated in operations in northern France and Norway. After the war, he joined the CIA and served in postings from Italy to Vietnam, where he oversaw the controversial Phoenix program. He was appointed CIA director by President Richard Nixon and confirmed by the Senate on September 4, 1973. He served until January 1976. In his 1978 memoir, Honorable Men, he devoted 4 paragraphs to Team Bruce, 2 sentences to the checkpoint in the Haute-Saône forest. No details of the weapon. The T3E1 files were still classified secret in 1978. He died on April 27, 1996, when his canoe capsized on the Wicomico River in Maryland. He was 76. In George Hyde, the German-born engineer who designed the M3 never patented it. The design was a work-for-hire government contract. He received no royalties from the 622,000 units produced. He died in 1958. His name appears on no monument. The 4-page OSS technical summary describing the T-3E1 field performance, the document that established the foundation of what would become modern American Special Operations Suppressor Doctrine, was declassified on March 14, 1994, and it had been in a box at the National Archives for 49 years. The box was labeled OSS Technical Division, Equipment Assessments, 1944, Confidential. Below that, in pencil and handwriting no one ever identified. Good work! There is a farmhouse in the Haute-Saône region of France that still stands. You can find it on a French topographic map if you know the coordinates. The kitchen garden faces northeast toward a pine forest on a slope. In summer, and the forest is dense enough that on a quiet morning you might not hear a branch falling on the other side of the hill. William Colby knew something about that on the night of August 14th, 1944 at 2:17 in the morning, when 4 German soldiers were standing between him and a 22-year-old woman who hadn't talked. And he had a plumber's nightmare in his hands and needed the night to stay quiet. It did. If you found this story as extraordinary as we did, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it tells us to keep going deeper on stories that most history channels will never touch. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss one. We release every week and every video goes this deep. And we want to know, do you have a connection to the OSS, the SOE, or the French Resistance? Is there someone in your family who served in a theater we've covered? Tell us below. Those comments are why we're here. The long whisper. Here 35 seconds to detach it. 4 German soldiers, 1 French woman who didn't break. Sleep easy.